Welcome to Exhume, an underground retrospective of arts and culture in the late 20th century. I'm your host, James Wallace. Today, we come to the conclusion of Marquis Smith and the Falls' career. After Brix's departure, Smith would continue the Fall through the 90s, into the millennium, and right up until his death in 2018. Smith's first album, Post Brix, was Extricate. This album continued the use of electronics, and the song Telephone Thing was remixed by the electronic duo Cold Cut. The song had a sound similar to the bands of the Manchester scene of the late 80s, such as the Stone Roses or the Happy Mondays. Elements of hip-hop scratching were incorporated into the song. Smith tries singing the beautiful yet sad Bill is Dead, where he declares that this is the greatest time in my life. One gets the feeling that he was maybe trying to come to terms with his breakup with Brix. Martin Bramo was brought back in, but he only stuck around for one album. Over the course of the early and mid-90s, the Fall would continue to produce several albums that kept incorporating electronics with their dirgy guitar sound, Shift Work, Code Selfish, The Infotainment Scan, and Middle Class Revolt. What was really interesting was Smith's desire to cover songs. On Shift Work, Smith's covered White Lightning, which was written by the Big Bopper but made famous by country great George Jones. On Code Selfish, they recorded a cover of Hank Williams Sr.'s song, Just Waiting. On The Infotainment Scan, the band covers the disco classic by Sister Sledge, Lost in Music, a novelty song called I'm Going to Spain, and Why Are People So Grudgeful by the famous reggae musician and producer Lee Scratch Perry. On Middle Class Revolt, they cover War by Henry Cow, Junk Man by the Groundhogs, and Shut Up by the experimental 60s garage rockers The Monks, whose songs I Hate You and Oh, How to Do Now they covered on Extricate under the titles Black Monk Time Parts 1 and 2. The band recorded Extricate, Code Selfish, and Shift Work on the label Fontana, while Infotainment Scan and Middle Class Revolt were released on Permanent Records in the UK and famous indie label Matador in the States. Brix returned for the tour for Middle Class Revolt, but they did not rekindle their relationship. She was shocked by Smith's appearance. He looked like he had aged decades. He was drinking copious amounts of alcohol and was continuing to abuse amphetamines. Smith was also becoming more unreasonable, and his erratic behavior was well documented in British music mags. I remember seeing The Fall at RPM in Toronto in 1994, and Smith certainly looked worse for wear. Brix would remain in the band and record the 1995 album, Cerebral Caustic. The album starts out with the dynamic The Joke, which remained a regular at Fall live gigs in years to come. Brix's influence was apparent in songs like Don't Call Me Darling and Feeling Numb, a song where Smith describes the effect that the antidepressant Prozac had on him. The album also features the experimental Bonkers in Phoenix, a cover of the Frank Zappa song I'm Not Satisfied, and a re-recording of the 1990s B-side Life Just Bounces. Later in 1995, the band would record the single The Chiselers. During the recording of the single, Smith fired longtime guitarist Craig Scallion. He would later admit that his drinking was affecting his judgment. 1996's The Light User Syndrome was the last album with Brix. She would end up walking out during the tour, and bassist Stephen Handley would describe a concert in Worthington as the worst gig ever. The follow-up album, Levitate, was recorded under extreme tension. The band owned a VAT bill that had accrued interest over the 80s and 90s and was now £200,000. Drummer Carl Burns returned despite being fired after the recording of The Light User Syndrome. Levitate contains probably their most unique cover song. Smith decided to cover the comedic 1959 song I'm a Mummy by voice actor Bobby McFadden. But a complete disaster was unfolding. The VAT bill almost resulted in Smith and Handley having their houses repossessed. Smith fired the whole band when they were in Ireland, only to rehire them a few days later. Then things would explode at a gig in New York City. Most of the band walked off stage 3 days earlier at a Philadelphia gig, leaving Smith and current girlfriend Julia Nagel playing on stage together. At the gig at Brownie's on Lower East Side of New York City on April 7th, 1998, things exploded on stage. Smith started messing with Carl Burns' drum kit, which started a physical fight between Smith and the band. The fight continued at the hotel, with Smith and Nagel getting physical with each other, and eventually the police were called. Smith was arrested and spent 2 days at Rikers. With the exception of Julia Nagel, the rest of the band quit, including Carl Burns, who had been in and out of the band since 1977, and Stephen Hanley, who had been in the band since 1979. Smith was ordered by the judge to go through an anger management course. Smith claims after leaving Rikers that he had a premonition of the Twin Towers coming down on September 11, 2001. He stated to a policeman that the buildings didn't have a proper joist and could come down at some point. Nagel and Smith reconciled, and she helped them form a new band. The Marshall Suite was released in 1999, and it would begin an 18-year journey where Smith would record albums with ever-changing lineups of the band. Often these albums would have a more garage rock feel to them. Interest in the band was growing, and Smith's unique musical vision was praised by music enthusiasts. Henry Rollins would often play fall tracks on his radio show, Harmony in My Head. In 2004, the BBC would produce a documentary examining the fall called The Wonderful and Frightening World of Marky Smith. In 2014, 3 Danish fall fans released the documentary It's Not Repetition, It's Discipline. Smith would produce some amazing tracks over this period. One standout is the Hypnotic Blindness from the 2005 album Fall Heads Roll. Smith would marry Greek-German Elena Palau, who had joined the band. She would eventually leave Smith in 2016. 66 musicians were in the Fall over the course of the band's history. Even though it was a kind of Marky Smith solo act, because it was always different groups, members' pay may have been better than if the albums were released under Smith's name alone. Smith saw himself as running the band like a work crew on a building site. Smith used to keep the band's wages in a bag and distribute them by hand, rather than through check or bank transfer. Smith got a lot of admiration because right up to the time of his death, he insisted on producing new music and making that music the focus of his concerts rather than the old material. Many bands tour on their hits from yesteryear, but Smith refused to do that. The downside of his approach was his stubborn and irrational behavior made him difficult to work with. And there was also his addictions. Years of heavy smoking, alcoholism, and amphetamine abuse would eventually catch up with Smith. He developed a number of health problems and would eventually develop cancer in the lungs and kidney. He came on stage in a wheelchair on November 4th, 2017 to perform. On January 24th, 2018, Smith passed away. Tributes came in from numerous artists: Liam Gallagher, Billy Bragg, Suede's Brett Anderson, Elastica's Justine Frischman, Garbage, Superchunk, Henry Rollins, The Pixies, and many, many others. After all they had been through, Brix still considered Mark to be her soulmate. Smith created one of the most unique music groups of the late 20th century. The way he used narration, stream of consciousness, repetitive choruses, all done in a working-class Manchurian elocution, was inimitable. Indie rockers today emulate the jagged rhythms of the Fall, and their music has a quality that feels as relevant today as when it was produced. Marky Smith was a visionary artist who refused to compromise. There will never again be a figure in music quite like him. Thank you for listening to Exhumed. I'm your host, James Wallace. Tune in to the next episode to look at more arts and culture in the late 20th century.